Briefly, I'm Gaurav Singhal, former Chief Data Officer of Foundation Medicine, trained as a computer scientist and physician, and spent many years building clinical genomic databases with Amy and others to advance R&D in the biopharmaceutical industry and clinical care. I'm here with my colleagues, Amy Abernathy, Andrea Ramirez, and Lloyd Minor, who are all legends in the field and have done a tremendous amount to advance precision medicine in the era of genomics. So without further ado, I'll have each of them please introduce themselves and describe their relationship to the field.
Hi, it's a delight to say hello to everyone. This is my third DataVant conference. I was thinking about that today. I'm Amy Abernathy. I am president of Clinical Studies Platforms at Verily, which is the clinical research business line. And prior to that, I was principal deputy commissioner at FDA until April of 2021. And then prior to that, the chief medical and chief scientific officer at Flatiron Health. And my relationship to precision medicine is long. I am an oncologist by background. I've been thinking about this space together with Gaurav and others. But recently, and most focused, I've really been thinking about precision health, because medicine actually is the starting use case for how do we think about tailoring and matching all of the details of the 360-degree view of health to be more precise for the individual.
So good morning, great to be here as well. My first DataVant conference, so thank you so much for having me.
Welcome.
My name's Andrea Ramirez, and I'm the Chief Data Officer for the All of Us Research Program, which you may have known formerly as the Precision Medicine Initiative. We're building a 1 million person or more database focused on inclusion of diverse populations, typically not represented in research, as well as providing genome sequencing and results back to patients. So really involving our participants in the study and engaging them longitudinally. So my role as Chief Data Officer is really focused on not only bringing value from a scientific standpoint and really saying how can we deliver the most value to the scientific community, but also making sure we maximize the value of our data from an analytics standpoint, because we're still growing. We still need to continue to recruit and continue to optimize our operations as a cohort to be successful with all of the other wonderful initiatives building around precision medicine to make sure that all of us really delivers value back and can deliver on our mission to really improve precision medicine and healthcare for all. So great to be here.
I'm Lloyd Minor, Dean of Medicine at Stanford. It's an honor to be here with such a distinguished panel and group of people at the DataVant conference. So I lead our academic medical center at Stanford, and we've been interested in data and the application of data to improving health and healthcare for a long time. We too firmly embrace the concept and notion of precision health, so to predict, prevent, and cure disease precisely, but hopefully in that order, with a lot more emphasis on prediction and prevention than perhaps we've had in the US healthcare delivery system in the past. As an academic medical center, we have a tripartite mission. We certainly provide patient care in our academic health system, which includes adult delivery system and a children's delivery system. And we teach and train a future generation of leaders and of course conduct research that drives improvements in care in our delivery system, but hopefully far beyond what we're doing in our footprint in Northern California. And I look forward to our discussion this morning.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. We talk a lot about precision medicine. We talk about genomics. Sometimes it feels a little bit like buzzword bingo, and I've heard people sort of ask the question, what's hype and what's reality? Let's start with sort of a note of optimism. If you look back on your careers in the last few years, if you could share what you think is the most impressive example of where, especially data, has impacted and accelerated precision medicine and genomics, maybe we can start there. We'll go in reverse order. Lloyd, if you want to kick us off.
There's so much going on. These are, sort of like a Dickens novel. These are the best of times and the worst of times. The worst of times in that we've just had a catastrophic pandemic that affected us in healthcare delivery very, very much, both in terms of our mission, but also in terms of our people. The best of times in that there's never been such a confluence of science and technology applicable to biomedicine and life sciences writ large. And the common theme across all those elements, as we've already heard this morning, is the theme of data. How do we get more data? How do we use that data to drive better decision making? How do we overcome some of the barriers to bringing data together in a way that it can be interpreted and become actionable? And of course, underlying all of this is how do we protect the privacy of patients and also the primacy of the patient in terms of being able to determine how their data is used and how they can access their data. And I think that's a challenge for all of us then to figure out how we can bring it together, how we can leverage the resources we have in our organizations to tackle these problems. And I'm convinced that that's going to require a convergence of entities in all aspects of the delivery system, certainly, but also in the commercial sector and in the academic educational sector to really determine the best way to break down some of the barriers today that exist from us being able to do what so many other industries and aspects of the economy have been able to do in a much more fluid way for a variety of reasons that are familiar to everyone here.
So it's really an exciting time, and I couldn't agree more. I'd say over the last 15 years or so since I trained, I've seen the delivery of care based on genome and genetics actually transfer from what was the research world into clinical practice. And two areas where I've seen that closest would be pharmacogenomics as well as diabetes care. So as a practicing endocrinologist, when I started, we would see this in the research world, we'd write papers about it, and it was interesting. But today, I can run a telemedicine clinic, see patients with interesting or atypical diabetes, and deliver their genome sequence relevant to their diabetes within a few weeks. So it sounds simple now, but 15 years ago, that was really unheard of and only done in a research context. So many barriers still exist. The other panels have addressed those. Certainly, this is not done in an equitable fashion. Certainly, this is not accessible to all. But really being able to deliver that care in clinic for something like endocrinology, which isn't the top of the list when you usually think about how we're using genetics today, has really changed my practice and what I'm most excited about, feeling that we're sort of in the middle, not there yet, but making good progress.
And as I think about what has been that progress across time, because I'm going to say that the biggest impact has been progress. You know, I think back to the days of molecularly informed care and STI 571, and we first started thinking about, for example, imatinib in CML. And then, you know, that was a one-to-one match, right? And then across time, we started to think about data sets that came from many different spaces. So, for example, electronic health record data or longitudinal clinical data matched with molecular data, matched with individual details, including environmental data, that helped us now think about how do we line multiple pieces of information to now come together to inform the care of an individual that incorporates not just the one-to-one match, but multiple details. And what's interesting about what Andrea has just said is that it has been now the confluence of multiple different types of data and data sets that we have, coupled with the ability to continuously, in a stepwise way, inform and optimize care across time that is now becoming more and more precision medicine and precision health. Because as you think about it, it's not just informed by the one-to-one match as a single moment in time, but actually what you learned about what happened before and what this patient needs next. So for example, in diabetes care, the ability to have continuous information about this person's intake, their behaviors, glucose, and how all of that now comes together to a stepwise management of diabetes in a much more precise and personalized way for this individual.
Fantastic. You've all mentioned precision health, which as I understand it is taking a lot of the principles of precision medicine, which we've seen evolve over the last few years, and bring them into the preventive care setting. Lloyd, you've written a book about this, and Andrea, you just mentioned pharmacogenomics. When I think of that sort of concept, preventive health and genomics, pharmacogenomics is the first thing that comes to my mind. And I remember, many years ago as a resident, this was going to be the future, and we were going to dose patients based on, anticoagulant dosing and Plavix dosing and everything else. Andrea, it sounds like you're seeing it in your practice. I can't say I've ever used pharmacogenomics, and maybe I'm just exposing myself here, but I would love to hear, where do you think pharmacogenomics has gone? Do you feel like it's been rate limited in some ways? Do you see that changing in the next few years? We'd love to hear from you, Andrea, and then from you, Lloyd.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I was using diabetes because I thought you were going to talk about oncology, but the leaps forward in care. So pharmacogenomics, near and dear to my heart. I spent years looking at records and warfarin dosing and Plavix and writing all of the CYP2C19 research papers. And how do you keep that up to date enough to put it into context of the other data. When we think about it, it sounds great. Pharmacogenomics, though people don't understand that, we're calling it medicine in your DNA now to make sure people understand that impact. It is just another data point when you're the patient. It's not something new and cool. They don't want the newest, coolest thing. They want to know what's going to not give them a GI bleed. They want to know what is going to prevent that next heart attack. So if clinical data does that, we need to keep genome data in context with all of the other data we can use to build the best predictive models and deliver the best care. So it's not what we thought 15 years ago, an easy win, one size fits all, going to change everything. It gets put into the clinical decision-making process like any other data point. And helping train physicians to understand that and providers to understand that has been something that we all have worked on to understand, not just looking at one data point, but making that best shared decision for the patient. So drug companies, other payers, people have helped keep in perspective that genome's just one piece of the puzzle as it goes. There are examples that we can look to that really have made a difference, like turning people from Plavix and putting them on better anticoagulants. But putting that whole clinical decision-making picture together still needs a lot of work on it and more discovery there.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Lloyd, your thoughts?
I think, your examples are great, and as an informed and trained leader, you deploy those for the benefit of your patients. I think one of the challenges we face is that most of the physicians in practice today were trained before or around the time that the human genome was mapped and before its implications were understood. And so I do think we have an educational gap on the provider side. And we also have some challenges with at least some payers of understanding the value that pharmacogenomics, and I like your term, medicine and DNA, how that really can drive improvements in value and in outcomes. So I think those are areas we have to focus on in parallel is education of the physician workforce as well as of patients to understand when to ask for this type of testing, and of payers not only to allow the payment for it, but in some cases to actually insist that there be some pharmacogenomic screening testing done prior to the initiation of therapies where we have clear data that the decision-making can be improved and the value improved by knowing the correlate between the genome and the patient's condition that's being treated.
Lloyd, you brought up payers. I think that's a super interesting question here. Certainly I experienced this in my time in Foundation Medicine. The world of precision medicine feels like it's being advanced mostly by pharma, who's incorporating biomarkers in their trials when it makes sense to do so from a efficiency of development standpoint. But there's a whole other world of precision medicine that could help us understand patients who shouldn't get a particular treatment because they won't respond. But it feels like that's not really in anybody's sort of charter to pursue. So I'm curious for anybody on the stage, maybe Amy, if you want to kick it off, sort of lots of questions around this. Who should pay? How do you make sure that the right questions are being asked? And are there other actors who should be on the stage who aren't there today?
So the first thing I would say, it's been interesting. As you point out, the personalized medicine, the precision medicine story really started and was being pushed forward on the pharma side, and the payers were saying, no, and let's wait. And practically speaking, if we want patients to have access to interventions that work, we actually have to also pay attention to how that access happens. One of the challenges is generating the evidence that payers need, as well as generating the evidence that, for example, leads to a regulatory decision for an approval or clearance. And I think that one of the challenges that we've had in the precision medicine space is that we not only need to generate the data, we need to do so in a comparative effectiveness way and with enough scale that payers actually can use that in order to make the right reimbursement decisions. Practically speaking, what I've hoped to see and what I think is one of the really great opportunities in the precision health space is the building of longitudinal data sets with payers at the table that allows us to then start to generate the information about really what interventions work for which patients and which subpopulations. And I think one of the things that is likely to happen as that story moves forward is going from the place of the pharma side and a regulatory decision opening the aperture for everybody who has that match to getting an intervention to the other side of precision which may happen now by including evidence generation on the payer side of the equation, which means that we start to understand who is truly appropriate, which actually starts to hone down who gets a particular intervention, and that may be more informed by the payer side of this equation.
I'll follow up. One question I have that comes up a lot when we think about who should pay or what we do with the data, we always assume we need to generate the data again. But in the future, and what we see happening now, is that the data is already there. So many people in the pharmacogenomics space have designed trials saying, let's go ahead and invest in the genomic sequencing ahead of time by people who we know are at risk for conditions that are necessary to use precision and pharmacogenomic dosing of drugs, so that they already have it. So a large trial in Europe showed the efficacy of kind of a pocket card in their wallet that already had their sequence ready to go. And the NHGRI-funded Ignite initiative is also looking at that here in the United States. So having the data ahead of time and then building your models is different and a data availability question than saying, hey, we need to pay for it again, when we know people are at risk for conditions that will come up and benefit from that care.
Lloyd, any other thoughts?
No, I think, I like all the points. I think having the payers at the table and designing the trials and understanding the regulatory process is going to be really critical at getting pharmacogenomics rolled out in the way that I think we all believe that it can and should be.
Great. Now, you mentioned clinical genomic data, Amy. Obviously, we spent a lot of time thinking about that. But as I look down the sort of aisle here, Andrew, you're building a database, but also an entire community of participants, a biobank. Lloyd, you run a major academic medical center that has its own biobanks and longitudinal studies. As we think about what this sort of enterprise looks like beyond clinical genomic data, how do biobank samples fit in? How do sort of longitudinal participant engagement fit in? Are there other components to this sort of data platform that ultimately unlocks this sort of R&D future, Andrew, that you're talking about that maybe is sort of always there and always on? Maybe I'll let you sort of take it first.
Sure. So the All of Us research program lives and breathes this every day. How can we best use taxpayer dollars to build a set that will be useful not just today, but for decades to come? How do we include the right participants, keep them engaged, return value so they understand the utility of their participation in our study? I think making it as easy as possible for our participants is something that we want to be sure happens. So consenting them, understanding their longitudinal contribution doesn't have to be every day talking to us, but using electronic health records, using databases that are available that allow that passive acquisition of data, and then understanding from investigators what the gap is, what is the active contribution participants need to make, so that we right-size it. We don't bother them too much. We don't scare them away. We really keep them engaged and let them understand the discovery happening from the data that they're contributing might not get to their clinic today, but for the next 10 years, their kids' kids, this is a foundational data set that we really need to build to help understand bringing together those different data types. So I think that's how we're thinking about our participants.
And I'll follow on there, Andrea. So as Verily, we're part of the underlying technical infrastructure for all of us. And you know, as I think about building these longitudinal data platforms for the future, there are a couple of foundational elements to get right. So one of them is planning for longitudinality. As we've said, the precision health story of the future isn't just complex multidimensional data. It's actually honing care across time, and that's inherently longitudinal. And I submit to you, most of our evidence generation in the future is going to be more and more longitudinal. For example, the need to follow up cell and gene therapies for 15 years. And so longitudinality is critical to this story. But another thing is critical, and that is data quality. We can't actually make confident, high-risk decisions if we don't have the kinds of data sets that we can trust. And so that means as we leverage not only data intentionally collected, for example, in the context of a prospective study, but also data that is passively generated in the system, such as electronic health record or claims data or other passively collected real-world data sets, we need to make sure we deal with the data quality mismatch that comes from trying to put all those data sets together, whether that's data conflict errors, such as 11 different source systems for just gender and what happens when they don't match, to also issues such as missingness of critical variables that may need to be collected, including variables that are ephemeral, like patient-reported information and patient-reported data. So data quality is a second kind of critical aspect of such a system. And then the third is kind of going back to what Andrea said about the interaction with the individual patient. Patient centricity is going to be very important, because as we talk not only about the importance of longitudinality, we're also importantly talking about trust and transparency, and giving people the opportunity to put their hand up and say, yes, you can recontact me in the future if you find something important for me, or if there's something for me to participate in, et cetera. And so the infrastructure needs to solve for those things. And I think that's where this story is going in order to solve for precision health data sets.
The one thing I would add is that there are these wonderful repositories that are being put together, All of Us, the Million Vets Project. Even within our own academic medical center, how do we get the biobanks that exist to talk to one another and to exchange information in ways that when we have a specimen that is related to a question that's being asked by a different study that has a different biorepository, how do we access those specimens in a way, obviously, that's compliant with the consent that's been given? But I think it's going to be really important that these large longitudinal studies, and of course we're working with Verily and Duke on Project Baseline, that there be a mechanism to share information across these platforms, because a huge amount of infrastructure, resource, and economic resources being devoted to establishing these databases and repositories and making sure that they can talk to each other in a compliant way, I think is going to be really important.
I want to pull on this biobank thread because I think it's so interesting. I feel like it's absent from most of the conversation about what's ordinarily de-identified sort of linked data in the background, but it feels like an untapped resource that just intuitively feels like in the next decade will become much more of a centerpiece. I'm curious if you feel, Lloyd, you pointed out a lot of the biobanks are siloed, they're not sort of connected, they don't talk to each other. It seems to me that a lot of them have sort of a limited sort of metadata universe as well that sometimes is fixed. Do you, Andrea or Amy, do you see critical changes in how biobanks become part of the story in the future, or maybe you don't agree, which is great too?
So I'll start. I do think biobanks are a critical part of this story, but I'm not sure we have figured out fully how and when to use them. We have, massive numbers of bank samples, and oftentimes don't understand when to pull that thread. Practically speaking, also, samples become stale or inappropriate if we are not thinking about how to do that. One of the aspects about biobanks that I've been thinking a lot about is not only making sure that we understand what is banked, but also how that fits into longitudinal context of what we understand about a person and their health and their longitudinal health. A sample that, for example, is a tissue sample taken before the patient has received anti-neoplastic therapy is different than the sample that's taken after the anti-neoplastic therapy. And so understanding what came before and after. And so really, how do we put these elements together where the biobanked information is linked into the right clinical information with patient understanding of what's going on and patient transparency, and really secure and private systems on the back end. And I think that's one of the other things that we absolutely have to solve for.
Yeah, what I would add to that, I agree 100%. And I think in parallel with this, we've got a lot of work to do to rebuild trust in science, and trust in what the opportunities are out there. There's nothing more important than protecting the privacy of patients, protecting the individual's right to choose how their data is used. And yet, if we're not able to, as you described, bring together this data, the metadata plus the genomic data, in a way that can aggregate the data to drive more information from it, we're always going to be hampered with not being able to get the type of actionable information. And I think the privacy concerns are one of the real limitations, real and perceived limitations to being able to move this forward in a way that I think we'd all like to.
Yeah, maybe we talk about privacy for a moment. Privacy in the genomic era becomes very complicated. Amy, you've thought a lot about that, I know. Andrea, I'm sure you did as well, as you sort of set up the All of Us initiative. Curious your thoughts on what's changed in how we think about privacy given sort of the resolution of genomics, and do we have to think about things differently going forward?
I'd love to hear from Andrea first, yeah.
Oh, sure, happy to. So again, something that we really have to communicate continuously with our participants, right? We need to have them understand what we are doing and what we aren't doing. I think something I think about is your comment about, is it real or is it a perceived threat? And also making sure we're not being paternalistic, assuming that people don't want to share. What you hear from rare disease communities is, please stop holding my data back, give it to everyone. Why wouldn't I want a drug company to have my data? They can create a new drug that might help. So there's certainly many elements around those thoughts that would need a deep dive and understanding and checks on that in a consent process. But I want to make sure we don't get stuck in the old view that all sharing is bad, because many people don't think that. Many people understand all of the data Google has about us, and they know that our phone knows exactly where we are. So I heard in a panel earlier, right, why doesn't our health system know what we want? Google does. Everyone else knows what we want. Why don't you, doctor in front of me, know enough about me? So I want to be sure when we advance these privacy concerns that we're able to have that discussion. And that has a lot of regulatory elements to it as well. But this is just something that we have to live in the present and address as our world as it is today, but look forward and build the future where we get out of those silos, where we're preparing our data to a high quality standard so it can be combined with other data sets. We know at scale that's going to be necessary, and it's a great question to bring groups like this together to think about.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrea. I know we have a few minutes left. I want to take us into the future. Before we do that, Amy, you shared with me this concept of a central solve yesterday, which I thought was really clever. If you mind just sharing that with everybody.
Oh, okay. Hi. So oftentimes I think about this question of, like, if we could solve this thing, how would that thing unlock all the other problems that we're trying to solve? Last night, also the conversation of highly leveraged solutions. And, practically speaking, one of the questions that we had about 10 years ago was, how do we make it so that the data that exists around us, passively collected data, has value? These days we call it real world data, and we all sort of understand that it has value. Look where we are right now. But at the time, the question was, how do we make it so that real world data is valuable and people can see how it can be used into the future? And one of the tasks was to figure out what would it take to get FDA to approve or basically make regulatory decisions on real world data. And we then just started working on, how do you get to data quality? How do you make sure that FDA builds familiarity with real world data? How do you help pharma companies start to think about how to use it? How do we make sure that we have the tech industry at the table? And so we walked our way through. I think right now in this privacy conversation, one of the central solves that you're hearing on this stage in the background is consent and transparency. Building solutions that ensure consent and transparency not only unlocks a person's ability to say yes or no, but it's the starting of a permissioning model so that you know everything else that you need to do. It allows you to be able to understand who's put their hand up and said, you can contact me in the future. It allows you to do so many additional things. So this, like, what are the things as a community, if we solve that, it unlocks what we're trying to do together.
Yeah, I love that concept. It's such a focusing principle for how to have huge impact. Lloyd and Andrea, I'm curious, do you have in your mind central solves that these are key nodes? If we could unlock this, the field would sort of grow by leaps and bounds, and so many things would follow. Anything come to mind for either of you?
I know all of us is trying to be inclusive. So we've had a deficit of underrepresented communities included in research, and just our first release of nearly 100,000 genomes last spring in March added over 40,000 variants never seen before because of our diverse populations. So we can't do this the old way. We need to be inclusive and make sure that communities left out are included in the future.
I think it's a brilliant point. I'd follow up and saying, by showing how what we've talked about today improves our ability to address the inequities in health and healthcare in our country. I believe we all believe it does, but showing it and having people experience it as a reality, that because of all of us, because of the type of platforms, Amy, that you've been involved in setting up in the past and now at Verily, that this really is improving access to care, improving outcomes of care, not just for a small group of people, but for everyone in the country. That, to me, will be a critically important factor in improving trust and the type of confidence that's needed to bring together the data in transformative ways.
Fantastic. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much to my panelists for joining, and thanks for everybody for attending.